The major role of the cardiovascular system is to transport oxygen from the gas exchange surfaces of the alveoli in the lungs to the tissues all over the body. The body cells need a constant supply of oxygen in order to be able to carry out aerobic respiration. Now, for us to get to the deepest part of this, how the cardiovascular system transports oxygen, there is an important molecule that is going to be of discussion, and that is going to be hemoglobin, because it is the one that is responsible for combining with oxygen and transporting it in red blood cells to the tissues where it is removed and used by body cells to carry out aerobic respiration. So, our major emphasis in this tutorial is about hemoglobin. Oxygen is transported around the body inside the red blood cells in combination with a protein, hemoglobin. Even when you are discussing biological molecules, you discussed proteins, and under proteins, you talked about hemoglobin, which is also a protein molecule. Now, this hemoglobin molecule is made up of four polypeptides, and each polypeptide contains one heme group. Each polypeptide contains one heme group, meaning that a hemoglobin molecule, we have four heme groups. Each heme group can combine with one oxygen molecule. Each heme group can combine with an oxygen molecule. And since the hemoglobin molecule is made up of four heme groups, all the four heme groups are going to react with oxygen, or they are going to combine with oxygen, and each hemoglobin molecule will carry four oxygen molecules. Each hemoglobin molecule will carry four oxygen molecules. When you look at that in terms of atoms, each hemoglobin molecule can combine with 8 atoms of oxygen, recording that an oxygen molecule is diatomic. If we have 4 oxygen molecules, then we have 8 atoms of oxygen. The oxygen dissociation curve. For a molecule whose function is to transport oxygen from one part of the body to another, it must be able not only to pick oxygen in the lungs, but also able to release oxygen within the respiring tissues. Take for instance, during exercises, the tissue demands for oxygen are always high. Therefore, this molecule that transports oxygen must be able to release this oxygen to the respiring tissues during exercises at the shortest rate, so as to meet the oxygen demands for the cells. Hemoglobin molecule performs this function very well. It is efficient at picking oxygen from the lungs and efficient at releasing oxygen to the respiring tissues. To investigate how hemoglobin behaves or performs this function, samples of hemoglobin are extracted from blood and exposed to different concentrations or partial pressures of oxygen. We extract hemoglobin from blood and expose it to different concentrations of oxygen or partial pressures of oxygen. The amount of oxygen which combines with each sample of hemoglobin is measured. The amount of oxygen which combines with each sample of oxygen is measured, and the maximum amount of oxygen with which a sample can possibly combine with is given a value of 100%. The maximum amount of oxygen that can combine with each sample is given a value of 100%. And a sample of hemoglobin which has combined with this maximum amount of oxygen is said to be saturated. That is, if all the hemoglobin molecules have fully combined with oxygen. All these hemoglobin molecules are said to be fully saturated with oxygen. The amount of oxygen with which identical samples of hemoglobin combine at lower oxygen partial pressures or at lower oxygen concentrations are expressed as percentages to this maximum value. Let's say at a lower oxygen concentration of 10, this value where the hemoglobin molecules are going to combine at that partial pressure or the concentration of 10 is expressed as in terms of percentages to the 100%, which is for full saturation. The percentage saturation of each sample can be plotted against the partial pressure of oxygen to obtain a curve, and this curve is known as the dissociation curve. The dissociation curve shows that at low partial pressures of oxygen, the percentage saturation of hemoglobin is very low. That is, the hemoglobin is combined with only a very few oxygen molecules. But at high partial pressures of oxygen, the percentage saturation of hemoglobin is very high. That is, it combines with large amounts of oxygen. If we consider the hemoglobin within red blood cells, in the capillaries, in the lungs, where the partial pressure of oxygen is high, this hemoglobin will be 95 to 97% saturated with oxygen, because there we have high partials of oxygen. Therefore, each hemoglobin will have full complement of the 8 oxygen atoms, and that is, it is going to be fully saturated with oxygen. But when it comes to the respiring tissues, where the partial pressures of oxygen are low, then the hemoglobin will be about 20 to 25% saturated with oxygen. That is, hemoglobin will be covering almost a quarter of the oxygen atoms. From this, it tells us that the hemoglobin coming from the lungs carries a lot of oxygen, and as it reaches the respiring tissues, for example muscles, it releases 3/4 of this oxygen to the respiring tissues. This released oxygen diffuses out of the red blood cells into the respiring tissues where it can be used in respiration. The shape of hemoglobin dissociation curve reflects the way that oxygen atoms combine with hemoglobin molecules. If the partial pressures of oxygen are very low, only a few oxygen molecules combine with hemoglobin molecules. On combination with hemoglobin, it becomes successfully easier for the second and third oxygen molecules to combine with that hemoglobin molecule. And so the curve rises very steeply, indicating that there is activation of a hemoglobin molecule once it has combined with oxygen. A small change in the partial pressure of oxygen causes a very large change in the amount of oxygen which is carried by hemoglobin. That's why there is that steep rise within a small change in the partial pressures of oxygen. The Bohr effect or the Bohr shift. The amount of oxygen carried by hemoglobin is not only affected by the partial pressures of oxygen, but it is also affected by the partial pressures of carbon dioxide. During respiration, the body uses oxygen and it releases carbon dioxide, whose accumulation can affect the concentration of oxygen to be carried by hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide is continually produced by respiring cells, and it diffuses from the cells into blood plasma, from where some of it diffuses into the red blood cells. In the cytoplasm of the red blood cells, there is an enzyme, carbonic anhydrase, that catalyzes the following reaction: carbon dioxide and water forming carbonic acid. The carbon dioxide reacts with water to form carbonic acid, and this reaction, as earlier said, it is catalyzed by carbonic anhydrase. On formation of carbonic acid, it dissociates to give hydrogen ions and hydrogen carbonate ions. All these reactions take place within the cytoplasm of the red blood cells. The hydrogen ions that are formed for the dissociation of carbonic acid readily react with hemoglobin, forming hemoglobinic acid, thus releasing oxygen that it is carrying. When hemoglobin reacts with hydrogen, during that reaction, the oxygen that had combined with hemoglobin is released. The net result of this reaction is twofold. First is that the hemoglobin mops up or removes the hydrogen ions which are formed when carbon dioxide dissociates and dissolves. If a high concentration of hydrogen ions was allowed to accumulate, that means there would be low pH of blood. And if left in solution, the blood would be very acidic. Therefore, by removing the hydrogen ions from the solution, hemoglobin helps to maintain the pH of blood close to neutral, and in that case, it acts as a buffer since it's removing the hydrogen ions and slightly maintaining pH of the blood solution. Secondly, is that the presence of a high partial pressure of carbon dioxide causes hemoglobin to release oxygen, and this is what is called the Bohr effect. The Bohr effect is whereby the high concentrations of carbon dioxide cause hemoglobin to release oxygen. The high concentrations of carbon dioxide are found in the respiring tissues that need oxygen, and these high carbon dioxide concentrations can cause the hemoglobin to release the oxygen even more readily than it would do otherwise. That is, if we only have low partial pressures of oxygen and then we do not have high partial pressures of carbon dioxide, there the hemoglobin will not readily release the oxygen. But if we have both high partial pressures of carbon dioxide and low partial pressures of oxygen, then the hemoglobin readily releases the oxygen molecules. If a dissociation curve for hemoglobin is drawn at high partial pressures of carbon dioxide, it would lie below that of oxygen, indicating that at high partial pressures of carbon dioxide, there is more efficiency in releasing oxygen. To sum up our tutorial today, we have discussed that hemoglobin combines with 8 atoms of oxygen, of which 2 are carried by each heme group, since we have 4 heme groups in one hemoglobin molecule. We have also said that at low partial pressures of oxygen, few oxygen atoms are able to react with hemoglobin. But if there is a slight change in the partial pressures of oxygen, then it causes a drastic increase in the combination between hemoglobin and oxygen. Finally, we have been able to say that it is not only the low concentrations of oxygen that can affect the release of oxygen by hemoglobin, but also a high concentration of carbon dioxide is required for hemoglobin to efficiently release the oxygen to the respiring tissues. A blessed day to you all. Subscribe, share with your friends. Your tutors, Nampa Cosmos. Reach out on WhatsApp number +256 77 064 0570. Thank you.